Welcome everybody to the first Lunch and Learn of 2020. We're excited to have you here. I'm Todd Diefender from the Deputy Director of the City of Columbus Department of Neighborhoods. Our Director, Carla Williams Scott, will be here a little later and offer closing remarks from the department. We're very excited this year to be joined in doing the Lunch and Learns with the Women's Commission and the Women's Fund of Central Ohio, and really partnering with us in this conversation around a women's journey in Columbus. In addition to our partners who are helping to co-convene us, these sessions, we wouldn't be possible to be here today without our friends at the Ohio History Connection, without our tremendous panel, who are going to really offer their insights to us here shortly, to the Friends of the Community Relations Commission, and our friends at Hound Dogs Pizza who provided lunch today. So glad to have them. Also want to recognize two members of the Community Relations Commission who are here and really help to make this happen every year, Dr. Jindal and Allison Poirier in the back of the room. So thank you for what you do. Now it's my pleasure to bring to the podium one of our co-conveners, Shelley Biden from the Women's Commission. Shelley?
Good morning. I guess it's still morning, almost afternoon. Thank you for being with us today. As Todd said, thank you to the Community Relations Commission for hosting these conversations this year and for making gender as the topic for the series for 2020. We appreciate this opportunity to convene with their commission, but also as with the Women's Commission, our role and responsibility here in our city to listen to our residents and to take action. So we're pleased to have this role in our community and to be here with you today. As Todd mentioned, I'm the Executive Director of the Columbus Women's Commission. We launched about 3 years ago in Mayor Ginther's first inaugural State of the City address. And our work is around gender equity and economic position and economic security for women in our community. And it really comes from the passion of First Lady Shannon Ginther and the leadership of the mayor. Our work is, one, to raise awareness of women's issues, and two, use that to drive policy change in our community. And we're seeing results. Over 250 companies here locally have signed on to the Columbus Commitment, which is addressing pay equity and gender equitable workplaces. Just last week, we convened a press event to announce some new eviction policy reform with our friends at the courthouse. We also have work in teen health education, and also in workforce development and looking at creating career pipelines for women. And right now we're looking at the skilled trades for that space. We have 24 appointed commissioners. We do an open application process every year. And today, glad to have Jillian Olinger here as one of our commissioners, and a former commissioner, Nicole Ghazi, who is on the panel. And these individuals help guide our work, steer the work, help us stay in tune to needs of our residents and how we as a city can respond to that. The conversation as we think about moving policy forward here in our city, it's important to acknowledge and commemorate the 19th Amendment. For those who are on the front lines of change, but for those whose voices were left out in those conversations. Changing the story for individuals, for women, for families takes all of us. So thank you again to the Community Relations Commission, to the Women's Fund of Central Ohio, and to each of you to be together here to learn and to take action for women and all residents here in Columbus. So it's my pleasure to introduce Sarah Pariser, a tremendous partner in this work here in the city, and she is the Director of Grants and Programs at the Women's Fund of Central Ohio.
Thank you, Shelley, and thank you all for taking the time to be here today and in this beautiful building full of so many exciting artifacts. If you didn't have a chance across the hall to see some of the really incredible work that the History Center is doing, thank you. So, as Shelley said, my name is Sarah, and I'm with the Women's Fund of Central Ohio. And for For those of you who don't know what we do, we are a local foundation founded by women who saw an opportunity to look to the future and really think critically about what could they do to make our community better for women and girls. And with that laser focus, we are really looking at how can we address economic empowerment and leadership for women and girls. And this partnership is so incredible, from both the commission and having this entire year really dedicated to better understanding what are the issues that women in our community are facing and who are the leaders on the front lines of that work, to help bring us all together and think about what we can do to move this forward. And so for us, that makes sense to be a partner, because we mobilize the community to really think critically about that long-term change in the spirit of our founders. And we do that through research, grant making, programs, community events, raising awareness, driving policy, and training people and organizations to really think how they can implement and drive gender equity at all levels of this work. And so that's why it matters that we're here today, to really understand what our role is in the greater context and how we can all lead in this space. And so I'm really excited for us to be a part of this and to continue to drive this conversation, and how it relates to our work in driving conversations in terms of groundbreaking research and community partners, our grant partners, so many who are in the room, that it's really critical, the community comes together to make these decisions in terms of where the investment should go. And I'm looking around the room, and there are many of you who have been a part of this, whether it's board members, both past and current, grant partners, volunteers. We all are really critical to this work, to these conversations, to make sure that we uplift and empower all voices in the community. And to echo Shelley's sentiments about today, this matters, this conversation. It's really important that we learn from this movement from the last 100 years, and honor the fight to make sure that women's voices and perspectives are shaping our community, but that we learn from it too, and that we don't make the mistakes of the past, and that we are committed to not just an inclusive conversation, but an intersectional one, and bringing forward women of color's voices and making sure that this work is centered on, with, and around that, because we are only as good as everyone who has a seat at the table. And so how can we make sure that all voices are really driving these conversations forward? And you will hear from the experts. So I am so excited personally for this conversation, because I know that I'm going to learn so much. And I'm excited to see what happens after today as you all are mobilized to take this information forward. And speaking of information moving forward, and one of the first experts today that you get to hear from is Linda Wood. So Linda Wood is the Visual Resources Curator here at the Ohio History Connection. And she's going to be talking about a brief history of the suffrage movement, and then provide some additional context to the conversation today. Yes, Linda, thank you.
Hello, thank you very much. If anyone has any trouble hearing me, please raise your hand. I don't pretend that my voice carries particularly well. So, women in Ohio and across the nation began campaigning for the right to vote before the Civil War. The first organized women's rights convention was in 1848 in Seneca Falls, New York. But the second was here in Ohio in 1850 and then again in 1851. So Ohio women were really on the front lines of this fight for the right to vote from the very beginning. They were on the front lines here in Ohio in terms of what they were doing, but also nationally. When the Ohio Women's Suffrage Association was formed in 1885, one of the leaders of that organization, a long-serving president, Harriet Taylor Upton, she was also, in addition to running the suffrage organization at the state level, she was also a mentee of Susan B. Anthony and held executive positions in the National American Women's Suffrage Association as well. She attended the national conventions and worked closely with the national leaders. It's kind of interesting because I think she's sometimes one of the most important suffragists that not a lot of people know about. I think Jen is nodding in agreement. I think it's very important to remember her. So when they passed the 19th Amendment in 1920, it was a major victory. It had been in the works for 72 years. Generations of suffragists had been involved before Susan B. Anthony died, for example, in 1902, and her partner Elizabeth Cady Stanton died in 1906. And so, it was the women that Susan B. Anthony mentored, the many women she mentored who carried on the fight. And Elizabeth Cady Stanton, her daughter, became a very prominent suffragist in New York State. So it was really generations of women who got to the finish line in 1920, and it was only through determination and perseverance that they did so. Harriet Taylor Upton said it was hard work, and the people who didn't stick with it were people who they didn't stay positive, and they didn't just keep looking forward. So the thing was that it was not the end all and be all. It was really more of a beginning than an end, because African American women were not guaranteed the right to vote in southern states after the 19th Amendment passed. American Indian women, some could and couldn't vote after 1920. It would be a few more years before all Native American women were given citizenship and were able to vote. Asian American women wouldn't have passed to citizenship and the right to vote until after World War II. And we didn't pass the Civil Rights Act until the 60s that guaranteed all African Americans the right to vote. So there was still a lot of work to do. But also women wanted to vote because they were citizens and they were competent adults, and it was their right, obviously. But there was more to it. Once they got the right to vote, they believed that they could change everything, every aspect of their lives, their communities, their states, their country, the whole world. They believed that getting the vote was the first step to doing so many other things. And that's really exactly what they did. After they get the right to vote in 1920, they don't stop. They don't take a breath. They immediately form the League of Women Voters. The last convention of the National American Women's Suffrage Association is also the first convention of the National League of Women Voters. And that's exactly what happened in Ohio. The last convention of the Ohio Women's Suffrage Association is the first convention of the League of Women Voters of Ohio. So they do not take a breath. They introduced the National Women's Party introduced the ERA in 1923. So that's not a particularly new idea, the ERA. They were pursuing higher education. They were running for office themselves. It was in 1920 when the 19th Amendment passed. This was just a few years after the end of fighting in World War I. Many of the suffragists became very involved in peace activism. They were very concerned about the brutality of World War I, and they became involved in that. Many suffragists were also involved in anti-lynching activism. This is just a few of their activities. They did not hesitate to use this power that they now had. So they had many shared goals, but the reality is that the suffragists brought all the prejudices and, of society into their work, and society was very, very segregated in the years that the suffrage movement was actively working. But what we see in the past and in the present is that women are just more effective when they work together. The first Ohio suffrage parade was held in Columbus in August 1912. It was a very hot week. They were sharing headlines with the state fair and the city centennial. All sorts of things were going on. But black and white women marched together in that parade, and the newspaper coverage was phenomenal. Monster Parade of Suffragettes was one of the headlines, and it was effective. It got people's attention, and there were suddenly people who thought, wow, if they would stage this parade, thousands of women coming from other cities and other parts of the country to march through Columbus for the right to vote, perhaps they deserve it. Perhaps it is their right. It made a huge impression. And I think we saw that again in 2017 when women from so many different backgrounds went to Washington, D.C. or marched in their own state capitals for any variety of issues. Everyone had lots of different reasons for being there, but everyone raised their hands and their voices together. And it got more than a little media attention, to say the least. So I think that's the important message to look at from the past is, yes, it was often, the segregation in, the suffrage movement was often reflective of the segregation in society, but there were examples of women working together across, socioeconomic lines and ethnic lines and to work together. And that's the important thing to remember and to see that that's when women's activism is always most effective.
Okay, can you hear me? Welcome. I'm Jen Miller. I'm the director of the League of Women Voters of Ohio. And just quickly, as she mentioned, our roots come right out of suffrage. The Ohio Women's Suffrage Association was formed in 1890. There had been all these little women's suffrage groups across the state, but no convening organization. The National Women's Suffrage Association was also based in Ohio. But the Ohio Women's Suffrage Association was very different because the National Women's Suffrage Association was segregated. It really was not inclusive. And the Ohio Women's Suffrage Association did not agree with that. So it is true that at a convention in the Southern Hotel in May of 1920, the Ohio Women's Suffrage Association transformed by votes of its members into the League of Women Voters of Ohio. We consider ourselves to have, quote, 14 midwives of the League, various organizations that included newspaper women, business women, Nurses Association, teachers, the Council of Jewish Women's Clubs, the DAR, the Federation of Colored Women's Clubs, and many others. So from the very beginning, we recognized that we needed to work together, and our number one goal was, if we were going to have a new enfranchised population, to help this population vote. So if you can imagine, the Ohio Women's Suffrage Association had brought to the people on the ballot, had failed about 8 times to win full suffrage for Ohio women. Sometimes not even getting to the ballot, other times failing at the ballot. And so just imagine if you were a woman getting ready to vote and the people who know how to vote in your household, your brother, your husband, your uncle, your dad, your grandpa, they're not even supportive of that right. Is that who you want to learn from? Probably not. So the concept of the League is really for women to learn the process of voting and then to help other women vote. And so from the very beginning, it was about the mechanics, the how, the where, the when, and then very quickly became about becoming informed voters. So the League is actually the U.S. League turns 100 this week in February. February 14th, so Friday. And as I said, we turn 100 in May. But we are known for our nonpartisan voter guide, and this is something we still do today. But that started in Ohio in 1922. So this is something we are known for nationally. Millions and millions of folks from across the United States use that voter guide. It's vote411.org. Young people, there used to be this thing called a phone that hooked to a wall. And when you needed to figure out a number, you put in 411 and they told you, So anyway, vote411.org is supposed to be all the information you need to know to vote. And one thing I'll just mention for anyone who's worried, and when we talk to young people, they're worried about where good sources are. Anyone running for an office that we're collecting for. So we do have some local areas in the state where maybe we're not collecting for city council because we don't have a local league there. But at the state level in Ohio, at the federal level, and at most local levels, anyone running for office can submit their questions. It doesn't matter if they're major party candidate, minor party candidate, write-in. If they're running for office, they can submit their questions. So in 2018, we had 7 candidates for governor that had answers on our site. Most of us didn't even know there were 7 candidates, right? In addition, just to share, we don't edit those responses at all. I literally cannot edit those responses. Our system is set up so that if there's a typo in there, the candidate has to fix it. I can't. right? If they forget to put a picture up, I can't add one. And that's on purpose so that you hear directly from the candidates and that there's no editing in between. So I wanted to share just a little bit about that, but we have some incredible guests here. And to my left first is Nicole. She's the Director of Muslim Family Services, born and raised in Toledo, a graduate of Ohio State. She's been with the organization for 20 years, and the organization especially focuses on women and families. I am very familiar with her work, which I know is just incredible. So welcome, Nicole.
Thank you.
We have another organization that has stood for more than a century and fighting for the rights of all people. The NAACP was formed in 1909, so you're like our older sister. Yeah.
I'll take that literally.
Nana was born and raised in Columbus and had, and I think you work at Franklin University or have a relationship with Franklin.
No, I don't have one with them anymore.
Okay.
I don't do that.
Okay, all right.
Okay. I'm retired.
But she's retired. She's retired, but a long career in civil rights. So welcome.
Thank you.
And then I've had the pleasure of working with this organization as we look at materials in Spanish, but I've never had the pleasure of working with Liliana. So the Ohio Latino Affairs Commission. Liliana is from Costa Rica, but has lived throughout the world. So I really appreciate that you came to Columbus when you could have stayed in, like sunnier places. So thank you.
Especially in the wintertime, right?
All right, so we're going to talk a little bit about suffrage. The first thing I just wanted to kind of help everyone imagine, and then we're going to flip it to how this connects to today. So when women were working for the right to vote, there was forced marriages, child marriages, the inability to divorce, the inability to own property, the inability to really protect your children from all kinds of things, child labor, dirty water, actually. So the last cholera outbreak in Ohio is in the 1910s. We get the right to vote in 1920. So for women, this right was truly about changing politics, which then would change the economics and just the everyday, daily experiences of their lives, their children's lives, their families. And so with that, I just wanted to know, when you go to the voting booth, why? What does it mean to you?
Sure. So I think that when I go to the voting booth, when I think of a women's right to vote or anybody's right to vote, actually, it is sort of an empowerment especially for me and also for a large swath of my community. It's a shared ownership, of this nation that we choose to live in. And our vote is part of our ownership, is part of our claiming our ownership of what we are and what we want our nation to be. And it's not ideal. It's not ideal for everybody yet. But if we can continue to exercise our right to vote, then we've at least elevated and raised our voices to take some ownership of that, to take some responsibility of where we are now, and also to try to move that needle forward.
When I go to the polls, I'm standing on the shoulders of Sojourner Truth. I'm standing on the shoulders of Harriet Tubman. And when I go to vote, that's who I think about. Those are the sisters whose shoulders I stand on. And if we don't go to the polls, we will all be lost, especially women and black people. Thank you. It's so silly, Pedro.
As someone who made the United States my second home, I was born and raised in Costa Rica, and later on I decided to become a U.S. citizen. The privilege of voting is a great honor and a responsibility to build up the presence and the representation of who this new America is, a country where there's no majority, where there's no minority, but where we are truly a space where people of different cultures and worldviews have come together under the belief that the American dream still lives.
Beautiful. So, and I want to think about, is there inspiration you take from the suffrage movement? So for me, they say that the suffrage movement was 72 years old and the nation 144 when women finally got the right to vote. But that's not actually accurate because the abolitionist conventions had women's right to vote as part of it as well. And so really it's older than 72 years. But I think for me, when I think about this, and I think about my own organization, which kept failing to bring the vote to Ohio women, or I should say, Ohio kept failing to rise to itself to bring the vote to women. For me, this is all about how sometimes we can be in the midst of very significant challenges in how our government is operating, and yet we can persevere and achieve greater things. But I would like to know, as you think about the suffrage movement, each of you, whoever wants to go first, and if you don't want to answer, that's okay too, but if there's a certain inspiration that you get from that, or challenge.
I'll get started because to me this is a really, really important, especially today. In Spanish, we have an expression, and forgive me for going back to my mother tongue, but we say, los derechos de igualdad son los derechos de la humanidad. Equality rights are human rights. And if we go back to basics, this whole suffrage movement was created to provide women with political rights. And if we look at it now, what are we living through right now? If not a movement in our history when we are struggling once again to make sure that that equation balances equal rights to human rights. Women, as the most important voice within the home environment and raising our families and our society, have a critical opportunity today, as they had it those many years ago, to be the change that we want to see. And I believe that this whole wake up and inspiration and desire to make a difference has to move further than just being satisfied with being 1/4 of the representation when we get lucky. It is the time that we take our places in society, and it is through inspired people like everyone who's here that we will carry that responsibility forward, not by running hard and then when we get to the finish line, we quit. We gotta just keep going. It's a sense of urgency more than anything else what I feel, not only for me as a person from Latin America, but for my new African immigrants, friends, brothers and sisters, and my Asian brothers and sisters, and Pacific Islanders and Europeans, regardless of where you are. Just look at the room where you are. Look how different we all look.
So I think when I look at suffrage, suffrage did start before 1848, and it did have international ties. And I think that speaks, without going into detail of what those were, whether they were abolitionists or socialists, all of these factors, spoke to these movements. The underlying message I get is it speaks to the power of women to network, right? Because early suffragists reached out to their sisters across the pond and across the sea. And I think that the connections that were made in the suffrage movement were complex, right? Feminist organizing was full of tension. Everybody has different views, and there were communities that were left behind. But they still moved the needle forward. In Arabic, is the mother, and Ummah is the nation, is the community. And when you raise up the mother, you raise up the nation, right? It's the power of women, even within our Islamic tradition, that raise up the family and elevate and the dignity of all humans. And so I think that it's the power of women that really can speak to how can we bring the different voices together collectively, recognizing that we all have different voices and we are all entitled to our different voices, but is it our innate ability to communicate and to network that we saw in the suffragist movement that we can take to heart and learn some lessons from today as to how we're going to answer those senses of urgency that are before us now.
For me, in the NAACP, it inspires me to know that we have a voice. We had a voice, and now we've got a larger voice, but it's not big enough. I'm looking at all the sisters in this room, and we have a voice, and maybe what we need to do is do a march and say, get out the vote. Maybe that's what needs to happen. Maybe that is something that we can embrace and wrap our arms around that. I still believe that black women have not fared well in the election process. That's something that's a challenge for the NAACP. We too are nonpartisan, but when I hear of other organizations, and particularly white women organizations, I need to know at what point are you going to reach out to black women so we can all fight this together, as opposed to a little group here and a little group there. We need to become universal if we are going to talk about women's suffrage movement, because it is here today. We just don't call it that. Okay.
I want to plug really quickly, because I don't know how long we're going to talk about suffrage itself and maybe more about voting. So there are intersectional reading lists, as well as a discussion guide that looks at how issues of really movements for both racial and gender justice, how those have worked together in the past and also not. And so that we can learn from that as we move forward. So please make sure you get those. Those were created by an African-American women's scholar at Ohio State, a history scholar who's from Oberlin, and a children's librarian. So the list is literally baby board books up to heavy-duty history, and then the discussion guide is really more for high school and college and adult, but I hope you will grab those. They're free. I think it was really important to talk about, first off, we do commemorate. I encourage you to talk about commemorating the 19th Amendment and not celebrating it. And while I celebrate our 100th anniversary, we don't celebrate the 19th. And the reason is because the 19th Amendment doesn't actually give women the right to vote. It actually removes sex as a reason to take the vote away from someone. Okay, so this is slightly different. It doesn't say all women now can vote. It says you cannot be denied if that's the only reason. Okay, so and I just wanted to go back through that timeline. 1924 is when Native American women finally got citizenship, therefore couldn't vote before then. 1940s, Chinese Americans or Asian women finally got citizenship. 1965 Voting Rights Act. So if you think about all of the challenges, and there were challenges in Ohio as well, but definitely far more in the South for people of color trying to vote, men and women. 1980s is when, if you were a citizen who was working overbroad or were military, you finally got the right to vote. So this act of extending the franchise continues to move forward over the years. And today we still know, and maybe not all of us know. So let's outline how voting is not as accessible. Oh, I forgot ADA accessibility. There are two important acts, one in the 1960s and one in the 1980s, continuing to have problems. The League actually sued the state of Ohio in 2000 after the 2004 election for disability access to the voting polls. But we still have a lot of challenges to the voting polls depending on your demographic. So I was hoping any of you would like to expand on what some of those challenges might be.
I'll go first. I'm going to I represent the black community. Everybody knows that. I'm unapologetically black, and I need to keep saying that so you all really know where the NAACP stands on certain issues. The black community has a difficult time voting. They don't trust. Information is not imparted. In fact, the NAACP challenged the Secretary of State to break the tie to expend some funds for voting. He did not do that. He is now being accused of voter suppression, and that's just what it is. Because the provisional ballots, that's a problem. We've got change of addresses. People don't know how to even ask someone, are you registered? At the NAACP, we don't say, are you registered to vote, because that's an insult. So we say, have you changed your address or your marital status? We usually get a response to that. But there are challenges. Black community does not believe that they're getting their bang, if you will, for their vote. People are just not being forthright. We have voter suppression at a high magnitude, I would say. I don't know how this election is going to turn out for the primaries, because we don't have a way to tell people that you really need to come out to vote. So I must blame the Secretary of State in that endeavor. And I'm just going to stop on that. Okay?
I mean, voting experience in our community, I did pull up like our most recent stats from some polls that have been taken. And, you know, our voter eligibility within the Muslim American community is about 80%. Obviously, and a really hefty portion of us, about 47% of us are foreign born. So then you get into naturalization timelines and who's even eligible to vote, and then are they even casting their vote? And so we basically are looking. We are very proud and honored that the Women's Fund of Central Ohio has chosen to help us and support us in our endeavors to get our community in a nonpartisan way registered to vote, but not only registered, because we also have about, we have a good number of people registered to vote that is sort of in line with other communities. Our slackers are my children's demographic, the 18 to 29-year-olds, which is holding true across the board of other demographic groups as well. But our when we look at trying to get people engaged and civically voted, we are seeing that 83% of our community may express their intention to vote. In the last election, in the 2018, and 59% showed up. So there's a disconnect, and some of that disconnect is a distrust. Some of that disconnect is, nobody's really carrying my voice forward, and a disenfranchisement. There's a lack of choice of candidates. And then how do we get that information out? How do we share the information across the board about what candidates really stand for in a field storm of, information that's coming at you faster than you can process it, and how do you make sure it's accurate and holds true? So we do have some challenges in our community as well. There is inhibition to go to that poll. There is a fear of being challenged, and there's language barriers that exist that maybe you don't realize you can take somebody in. But even if you can speak the language, reading and writing sometimes come secondary and are at much lower levels than your spoken language, and you have to be able to read a ballot, right, to cast it. So literacy, certainly plays a role, with that. So interestingly enough, the single best indicator to determine voter participation is contact with local elected officials in the Muslim community. That is greater than any other determination. I don't know why. I've been looking at the research. I've been trying to figure that out, because we also have low likely numbers of people willing to go out and contact their local officials. And I'm talking locality across the nation. I'm not talking anything. I'm not calling out any names. But that, for some reason, is the biggest right now determinant right now that we're seeing in the American Muslim community for willingness to go out and vote is contact with local elected officials.
Give it to Liliana first.
I just want to add one thing. It's okay. I think it's fine. We do need to get people registered to vote. We need to knock on doors, help them do whatever it takes. But after we get them registered, how do we get them to the polls? I think that's a question that everyone in this room needs to answer. In the black churches, we do souls to the polls. It doesn't matter. Be a soul and get on the bus and we'll take you to register to vote. But I think we need to take a hard look at that. I've asked you to register. I've shared all this information. What's the next step? We need to provide transportation. Or you take one of your neighbors, take a seasoned citizen, take a person that has a disability. You have to reach out.
Yes. Well, all of the factors just mentioned that apply to the Muslim community, Arab community, apply very much indeed to the Hispanic community. In fact, in Ohio, we have a little bit over 400,000 Hispanics, and half of that population is eligible to vote. Yet, getting those people out is very hard because when you consider where are these people coming from and what is the background, many of them are still first generation or even second generation folks that have come from countries where they had to leave because of government issues, because of political unraveling, because of lack of trust on the system and the government. So when they come here and you tell them your voice matters and it will be confidential and you can trust the system, it's not that simple. So again, emphasizing those one-to-one relationships within the Hispanic community has been one of the best proven avenues, nationally speaking and locally as well, for people to learn to trust and to truly understand what this means. Because it's one thing to hear all that marketing that is coming out and flyers and all of that. That's very impersonal. I learn from when I sit down with you, I look at you at your face, I see your eyes, and you tell me, you build that rapport, then I believe.
That's great. So I really, really, really appreciate your challenge. I just wanted to mention a few ways that you can help if you're interested that are all nonpartisan. The first is the League of Women Voters works with COHIO, the Coalition on Housing and Homelessness in Ohio, to provide rides to the polls to anyone. You can also generally do that through your party. And then, of course, sometimes if you are nonpartisan. But here's the bottom line is there are a couple places. In 2018, I think we had 200 drivers across the state. And we could certainly use more, as well as just getting the word out there that we will transport folks. Language barriers, something that our friends at CARE do, the Council on Arabic and Islamic Relations, and I think we both partner with them. And in Central Ohio is they work to find multilingual poll workers and place them in the polling locations where those languages are most likely spoken. So if you have an ability, even if it's like a little bit of it doesn't have to be completely conversational, right? Because you're just having some pretty basic conversations. And obviously they work with the Franklin County Board of Elections to do that too. It's an incredible partnership, but if you have an ability to speak different languages, please come talk. We can get you connected with that.
We're one of the, MFS is one of the signers of, and we don't care if it's an interpreter for our community. We want everybody's community represented. So, yeah.
There are 866-OUR-VOTE, which is the nonpartisan election protection hotline. That is NAACP, the League, Lawyers Committee on Civil Rights. It's a national hotline. You can call and get answers all the time, and that is actually provided in English, Spanish, Arabic, and Asian Pacific languages. And so again, these are some sources that I just wanted to make sure to mention. Election protection also is critical in serving. If you don't want to be a poll worker, you can't work the full 14, 15-hour day. We always recruit every year individuals to either answer phones or to stand in locations, outside in locations where we know there are going to be challenges. So in 2004 in Ohio, election protection became critical and became the bedrock of the lawsuits that both the NAACP and the League brought to expand voting rights. And so things like that just so you know, things that occurred after that was the long lines, for example. The League's lawsuit, number one and foremost, was pointing out that it was a failure of planning, that they were not anticipating turnout. And if you don't anticipate turnout, you're not going to allocate your machines right. You're not going to allocate the right number of poll workers. You're not going to have the right number of a lot of things, right? And so that turned into these 4 to 6 hour lines that were harder if you were trying to do this in a half an hour on your lunch break, harder if you didn't have a car and you needed to, once you were finally done, needed to zip over and pick up your kid, harder if you were an elder or a person with a disability. In addition, that's where we got early voting. And so just know that election protection is absolutely a critical piece. And things have come full circle. I was a volunteer for election protection in 2004, and actually my work in the field became part of the lawsuit on the disability access piece. And I had no idea that I would be here at that point. I worked in the arts. So, and I was trained by my dear friend who with the NAACP in Cleveland, who is now still one of my best friends. So, so I'm just showing that. I want you all to know that, because here's the thing: democracy is a participatory sport, and not just as a voter, but as an advocate, as a helper. Let's talk about youth. So I think this was really good. Nicole mentioned that the 18 to 29-year-olds are not really voting the way they could. They could be one of the largest voting blocks in 2020. However, in 2018, only 31% showed up. So why do you think that is, and what can we do about it? Anyone?
I think there's a lot of apathy in our young generations. I feel that, at least within the Latino Hispanic community, there's a big struggle, and especially, let me bring it home to Ohio. We still have a lot of Hispanic and Latinos who are still first generation. So those folks are struggling at home with parents that are just trying to figure out, how do we make ends meet, while your young adults and children are trying so hard to fit into the American mainstream. So when you come home, you are a completely different person. You know, you have to be submissive, you have to listen to your mom and dad, you only speak Spanish at home, you only eat your tortillas. I mean, it's a whole different world. When you get out there into mainstream, you want to be the cool American kid. And it's a very difficult place to be. When they see what is happening in the national scene, and they don't see people who look like them, who speak like them, who understand where they're coming from, who treat them as less than American, because even though they were born here, you still speak with a funny accent and your last name is really long. So there's this lack of a sense of identity that makes them feel, why should I even care if no one really knows who I am or cares about me? And so that sense of apathy is something that we need to deal with, and it's not something that we can just tell parents, well, you take care of that too. Because remember, we're dealing with a lot of first generation. Interestingly enough, a lot of these newcomers, people that recently arrived here or recently became U.S. citizens, do have a lot more information about the importance of civics in your life than people that may be second or third generation. They have forgotten that. They have forgotten why we came here and what was the price of coming here. And so that's also another one of those historical struggles and dilemmas that oftentimes we miss out. But at the same time, I see great movement, not only within universities, campuses, and many other different groups, but our youth, the Latino youth, through Voto Latino, through people like Rosario Dawson, and through people like Maria Teresa Kumar. These young leaders are really becoming a fire that are telling our young people, you have the ability to change this country. It's up to you. So in the same way that there's a lot to be done, there are some good, very positive forces out there that are guiding the way, because there is no one at home that can do this for them.
I think we're asking ourselves, why don't they vote? I guess the question for me, it begs the question for me, have we asked them why they haven't voted? Have we educated them? I mean, we can't expect young people to do as we would want them to do unless we have a open and honest conversation. We need to ask, why aren't you voting? You know, what's wrong? And they need to tell us that. And once they begin to have that conversation with us, then perhaps we will be on the road to engaging our young people.
I did my scientific study in the car this morning because I have 3 kids in this demographic, right? So I just registered my 17-year-old to vote because she will be 18 by the election and she can vote in the primary. I did the same thing with my twins a couple of years back. And of course they have the fear of death instilled in them and mom that we are going to the poll. And also the caveat that the church we vote at serves donuts. So that gets my son there. So we kind of do the whole, the whole thing. But I say to them, okay, of your friends who aren't even registered to vote, why? Right? I want to know why they're not registered or why they're not voting. They graduate high school and they all get a voter registration card, right? And it is a lot of apathy, at least within the Muslim American community. There is a lot of uncertainty. There is a lot of, is this really my place in the world? Is this really my, are these people, do I have a home here? And yes, of course we have a home here. And there are so many, people that are welcoming to us. But I think that when it comes down to looking at the political minefield, it just becomes a real disenfranchisement of, who's really speaking for me or who's going to speak for me. And does it matter? Does it matter if I vote? And then how do we re-engage that conversation and get those kids to know that, yes, they do matter. And by the way, if all the rest of your friends and all the rest of their friends had voted, there is like you said, they're a big voting bloc. But I don't think that they understand that and see that.
Yeah, I haven't been in school for many, many years, as you can tell. However, there used to be a civics class, Problems of Democracy. I'm dating myself now, but I see this young lady shaking her head. And another one over here, Remembering. I know that you remember because you look like you're my age. But anyway, Problems of Democracy, and I don't know if that's being taught, but I can speak for the Columbus City School District. I do know that we have worked with them in getting high schoolers registered to vote, and there's one school that actually takes those young people to the Board of Elections to vote. So if we could all begin to work with the school districts, the school in your area to say, hey, we want to help and educate our children.
And actually, is Barb Hikes around? Would you just raise your hand? So back here, that's the president of the Metro Columbus League of Women Voters. If you are interested in going into high schools, the local league goes into every high school, prioritizing first all those within Columbus Public, but then throughout the area, every couple months registering more than 700 kids and having a fun time talking about civics, because civics is not taught anymore. And so I think, work through the NAACP or through the league. I just want to, if you come to me, I can't help you because I'm Ohio. So there's a table out there.
I also think we need to take it one step further. If you're educating the children, the child needs to go home and ask their parent, are you a registered voter? And let me show you, mommy or daddy, how you do it. Send a form home with that child, and that will trigger the parent. Well, I do vote, and they say, or I don't. So let the child be the conscience. And
I love that. It's kind of like, I mean, how many of us grew up with like the recycling program in school, right? Like there was a reason why that was started in schools and not with adults, right? Because it was a way of bringing that home. I wanted to just mention that we did actually sit down and have a listening session, a couple listening sessions with youth last year about voting. And both sessions were super diverse in terms of gender, sex and gender identity, income. All of them were Columbus Public. Like all of them were from Columbus, either Columbus Public or suburbs. Some were, not going to college. Some were going to Columbus State. Some were going to Ohio State. Some were going to private schools like Denison. Very mixed racially. A couple of them were military, active duty military. And we asked why they don't vote. And actually most of them didn't. And it was really interesting because, and it did not matter where they went to school or what their income level was. None of the socioeconomic factors that we might assume mattered. What it came down to was if they had someone in their life who showed them the ropes and instilled the importance of it. So I heard a lot of, well, I went and then I didn't have the right ID and then I couldn't da-da-da-da-da, or I was confused or I was scared or I didn't think blah, blah, blah. Or, it really hurt my heart when someone who had actually been, 24-year-old who had been injured in combat didn't think her vote counted. That really, really, really hurt me, and I felt, boy, am I failing. We're all failing this young woman who is serving for all of us, And so I definitely want to say that we should do these systematic things of getting into schools, right, and sending stuff home. But I couldn't agree more that some of this is literally about, finding the young people in your life, and even better, I mean, honestly, we got some pushy mommies up here, but even better if it's an auntie, right, or a mentor, because we have to fight our kids about all kinds of things.
Yep.
Now, she's not allowed to have dinner at my house if she doesn't have that. I voted. But seriously, sometimes the aunties, the neighbor, the baseball coach, these kinds of things really matter. Let's see, how are we doing on time? That's great. Let's talk about trust. I hear this one a lot about not trusting the system, and I think that doesn't matter on the age group. I'm hearing this. We know young people don't necessarily trust the system. We're hearing this among our new American populations. I think Nanny, you mentioned it too. So why do you think we're not trusting the system, and what can we do about it?
We don't trust the system because what has the system done for us? That's what some people say. What have they done? How do you regain that trust? I don't know the answer to that, but I do know that black people are not trusting of the system. We're saying, well, if I vote, is my life situation going to change? Is it going to help me get a job? Is it going to help my wage? What is it doing? Daycare, all of those issues. And if we don't see them addressed, then why should we do it? And we've got to change that. We have to teach people you're going to vote, and then you're going to have to hold these elected officials accountable. And if you don't, we'll vote them out and we'll bring somebody else in. I think that we really have to begin to have an open and honest dialogue with our elected officials, whether they're Democrat, Republican, it doesn't matter. They cannot take our vote for granted. And we've got to begin to have that conversation.
Trust is a non-existent word right now within the many ethnic minorities in our country, and that's just the reality. When we go back to telling our kids you are going to be safe, it's not true, because we have not only the very difficult circumstances that are being lived at our borders in this country right now, where we know that for whatever reason brought them there, not just from America, but from many parts of the world, we have people that are not getting an opportunity to be heard, regardless of the politics that go into it. And please do not misunderstand me. I'm not pro bringing people from outside, or I'm not saying the U.S. should be the shelter of everyone from all over the world. What I want you to think about is, what is the national narrative telling you and all of us about anyone who has an accent, a funny name, or a different skin color that does not precisely match whatever that, sector is expecting? So trust is a theory right now. It's not a reality. On the other hand, we can't just be there and get stuck, because this is no different than the fight that previous waves of immigrants and people that made the United States home had to deal with. Why did the Mayflower ever come? So this is no different. We don't get stuck in history. We gotta keep moving forward and realize that democracy is not something constant, it's something that evolves and adapts. But one thing that is definitely challenging our opportunity to get youth and adults involved in this sacred privilege of exercising your voting right is the national narrative, where you have politicians that when it's coming close to election time, everybody loves Latinos, and they all speak Spanish, and they all want to meet in the Mexican restaurant, and sangrias, and give me another burrito. But once that election time is over, whoa, you feel like you were left there
hanging dry. And so this is a perception that people say, why would I trust? Why would I pour out my heart, my need, my work, getting these candidates elected to office so that when they get to office, nothing happens? The big change that we are trying to produce is flip it. Instead of you seeking representation through the voices of others that may not really get you, start building up the capacity within your own people so that you run yourself, so that you become the faces of those making the decisions, so that you get a seat at the table. Because if you're not in that table participating on that conversation, then you might be dessert.
And we're seeing that a little bit within our community. We had two very powerful women that were elected, right, to the House. And we had a lot of hopes, right? Now we have a Somali American, who looks like a vast majority of good-sized population of our community. We have a Palestinian American, and they are being vilified, right? So while we're celebrating their achievements in our community and showing, especially our young girls, and our young men, that this is possible for you and this is what you can achieve, now we're seeing this vilification, and it just reinforces that lack of trust. Why would I put myself through that? And look what's happening. Yes, they got a seat at the table, but they're really not welcome there. They're really not. Just like any other woman or person of color, are we really welcome? And I'm not, and that is not to, I'm not sugarcoating it. That's just the way it is. And so our younger generation is smarter than ever. Right? They're so connected. Like, I remember being very vaguely remember being 18 and voting, but, nowadays, all the information is in their hand, right? Like, I explained to my kids, we used to have to go to the library to look up an encyclopedia. They think I'm talking Greek, because it's, everything is in their hand, and they're so empowered, and they're looking at this, and then they see that vilification, and they just say, well, no, we're not welcome at that table.
I want to comment on what both of my sister friends have said. I think if we don't get to the table, I can't remember the author that said it, take your own chair. Just pull your own chair up and take your own your own chair, because I've done that many times. If I'm not invited, I'll just say, well, I'm just going to go anyway. Yeah.
That's great. Well, let's talk about representation. So Ohio actually still very much lags behind in terms of women in office, people of color in office, new Americans in office. Why does that matter? Representation. How would a representation in elected office that was as diverse as Ohio's population, or even more so, how would that change the way government serves the people?
I can talk about that because I serve at the Latino Affairs Commission. We've existed for 43 years. We're the only state-funded ethnic minority commission. And I cannot tell you how many times when I meet with legislators, when I go to hearings, and I start talking about what the impact of potential bills may have on Latinos, how the face of those legislators changes with anguish over the fact that they did not know what this was going to do to people. And see, sometimes we fail as citizens to realize that once we elect somebody to office, we don't just give them this special power so they know everything about everything and, oh, you gotta know it because I elected you, right? Mm-hmm. We don't realize that they are human beings just like you and me. And they don't have the information they need. And they cannot have access to that information because you don't know what you don't know. And so when you ask me, how does that make a difference? It makes a huge difference. When we had two state representatives, Representative Ramos and Representative Perales, who are of Latino origin, and they were serving in different committees, I bet you anything you want, that committee knew what impact those bills would have on the Latino community. That's why it matters. But we don't have to go all the way to the state level, and we haven't had yet a state senator that is a Latino, but we do have Senator Maharath that is doing a lot of work and speaking on behalf of many other communities. And as we were saying before, neither one of those folks is perfect, and their voices may not be as polished as some of the other folks, but they matter. So it's critical for us to have people who look like us to be part of the conversations that build decisions.
I think that the three of us need to make some appointments and go down to the State House and let them know who we are and what we stand for and who we represent. I think that would be one way to do it. Thank you. I want a person that's going to represent the black community. I want them to know the issues in the black community. And if you don't, you should not be running for office. And I think that goes to my sisters right here as well. You're not going to represent the black community, I hope not, and we hold your feet to the fire. But you need to come and tell us what you're going to do for us, and we will hold you accountable by any means necessary. We'll just say we just don't vote for that. Not don't vote for them, but maybe that's not the good candidate for us because we are nonpartisan. We want you to vote, but vote for the one that represents you.
And I can tell you that I do. Part of my role in working with CARE is that I do go to the State House once a year, and we make those appointments, and we go to D.C. once a year, and we make those appointments. And I will tell you who we don't get audiences with. So we can't even get the audience to have the conversation to say, this is how your ruling is affecting my community. They won't even talk to us. They will make the appointments and cancel them when we get into the State House. And that's happened year after year. And I've seen it firsthand because I go with them every year for 4 and 5 years now. And it is hard. So yeah, how will representation change that? Because I think that you'll get, a diversity of voices is going to change, the overall conversation that has. And yes, everybody's entitled to their voice and everybody's entitled to their opinion. But when you at least dilute out and have some diversity, there may be a chance of getting to some sort of consensus, right, where everybody may get something as we kind of work towards, a greater good. But,
And
yeah.
I'll just say we have that experience. We work at the State House all the time, and we also have a State House Day.
bad then.
Yeah, no, and honestly, the folks that don't meet with us are the ones that seem to not understand basics of reproduction. Some just like basics of, how much women get paid versus men, and especially women of color versus men. And so I do think, but the point is that it's hard. And that's why we don't all do it, but that's why we need to keep showing up. I think that's right. We bring our chair, we bring our big smile, and we make our space. I wanted to make sure we do a couple of logistics things. First is the voter registration deadline for the primary is February 18th. Everyone, even if you voted recently, needs to check your registration. So I'm sure you've all heard, and this was mentioned, but you've heard of the purge where they're removing people who are infrequent voters. Here's the problem. There can be problems with those who gets removed. And so there are times that someone who votes all the time and hasn't moved and hasn't changed their name actually is accidentally removed from the rolls. There's also people that maybe they filled out their paper form and the very hardworking person at the County Board of Election just couldn't really read that birth date, right? And so they go and it's not lining up and things like that. So please make sure you can get on the Franklin County Board of Election, you can get on the Secretary of State's site and check your registration, every single one. And that's our new rule at the League. You're right. Have you registered? That's not, are you registered? That might seem condescending. But we always say, hey, have you checked lately? Let's do it. So February 18th. Provisional ballots. Ohio has some of the highest provisional ballot counts in the country. And that is actually because people fail to update their registration when they move. I think a lot of us just think, well, the BMV knows I moved, the Department of Taxation knows I moved. Like, why don't you know that I moved? So also just make sure with our young ones, especially, that they are updating that address, which is another piece that's super important. Provisional ballots, not only are we have some of the highest in the country, the rate for them counting is very low. Finally, I just wanted to mention that college students often have a hard time voting. And if you have a college student it's because it's a way confusing system. But in addition, in places like Wilberforce, and we've been working on this very hard, the address for their dorms is different than the address for the mailroom. And technically, that doesn't work. So make sure your colleges, if you have a kid away at college, that person, even if they don't technically have an address at their dorm, the college can create an address for them, and they can print out a form that can serve as their ID, like a utility bill, as well as the proof of their address for their registration. But I'm covering all of this because voting is clear as mud. Right? So it's hard for young people, it's hard for our growing elderly population, it's hard for our new Americans, and we are all here to help anyone with voting. So please think of all of us. And with that, and reach out to any of us. I have folks answering the League of Women Voters of Ohio phone line every day, and that's what we do, is demystify government. So if you need help, let us know, but so do all these other powerful ladies. I wanted to just ask you one final thought. If there's one thing that the folks in this room would leave with, what would it be? What would you want it to be? And then we're going to do a discussion.
You have the power. That's mine.
Political rights are equal rights.
And I think if we can respect and honor our differences, and capitalize on our commonalities, then especially as women, we're going to continue to move that needle forward.
Great. And so there's a discussion to be had at your tables, and the question is, what legacy from the suffrage movement do you want to take with you? And what maybe something that you believed, that you brought in with that you don't think is a helpful thought now, something you're going to leave behind? Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, after you talk about that for maybe 5 minutes at your tables, we're going to go ahead and have a group discussion as well. So think about something that you may want to share with everybody. Go ahead.
And I just wanted to, maybe we can give a round of applause one more time for these brilliant ladies.
Great. Thank you all so much for coming today. My name is Becky Odom, and I'm a history curator and manager of the History Services Unit here at the Ohio History Connection. With me here is my colleague, Karen Robertson, who is a manuscripts curator here. And we would like to, again, invite you to come up and share your responses with the group to the answer to the question, what legacy from the suffrage movement do you want to take with you, and what legacy do you want to leave behind? And I just ask that those sharing, if you'd be willing to just tell us who you are, and then share your thoughts and just speak into the microphone. Thank you.
Okay, so my name is Maddie, and at our table, one thing that we talked about, which ironically we'll go into this because I'm a tad bit nervous, is to find courage. Obviously, these women and the women that are in this room and the people that are in this room exhibit courage in ways that we are also grateful for, especially in today's society. But for me, I am 23, so I'm quite young. And I liked how they mentioned earlier in college it can be pretty difficult to get out there and vote. But also in college and as a younger individual, it can be really difficult to have the courage to navigate conversations that could be potentially awkward, whether people are mentioning some things that are pretty problematic. One thing that we mentioned is that, conversations in our society are constantly changing. So something that we find inappropriate today might have been something that was not found to be inappropriate 20 years ago to say. So having the courage to, kind of create a conversational speed bump, whether people my age or any age are saying, I don't think my vote matters. One thing one of the women at our table brought up, sorry, I don't know why I'm so nervous, is that is taking ownership in your vote. So encouraging and empowering your friends, people in your life, individuals that you work with to take ownership in their vote, to get out there and do it. And I know it's easy, speaking from experience, to create road bumps, maybe why you can't go out and vote one day or why you can't go and have difficult conversations with people. But have the courage to move past it. So, yeah.
Hi, my name's Carol, and at our table we talked as far as legacy goes, persistence and perseverance and not giving up was very inspirational, but also that relationships matter, that we need to build connections with people to help them get out to vote, and that one person can change things. And as far as a legacy that you want to leave, I guess in some respects, well, many respects, I'm very privileged, but one thing that I'm very proud of is that I have one of those young people too as a child. My daughter's 24, and she always came along when I went to vote. It was, I didn't have somebody to hand her off to, for one thing, but I made a point of showing her that that's what you do. That's part of your job as a citizen. And I was very happy that her school also encouraged voting. And I can remember in one of the presidential elections, they had a kids vote thing, and she went along and cast her ballot while I cast mine. And, she had to remind me when she went away to college in another state that she wanted her absentee ballot. What's the deadline, Mom? So that I feel is my legacy, being an example there and helping her grow up, understanding that that's part of her job. We also talked about women candidates and all the differences in the way that the media and the public talk about them versus the men or the male candidates, and how we'd like to see as a legacy that there are no articles in the newspaper about what skincare products the female candidates use versus, the rest of the female population, And just to have the courage to not wait for the men, but step up.
Thank you so much, everyone, for participating today. I hope that you found the group activity to be really enlightening and had some really good conversations. And I think now, who am I turning it over to? All right, now I'll turn it back over to Todd for some closing remarks.
Well, please join me in one more round of applause for our panel today. Thank you. And I think that our friends from the Ohio History Connection also deserve our applause and thanks, too, for hosting us. Thank you. And just really appreciate all of you for coming here today, being part of this conversation. I was realizing I think the first primary in the nation is going on as we sit here, so I guess it's a timely moment to think about voting and engagement as we head into this year. Really appreciate the conversation here. At the end of the day, each of us having that opportunity to think about how we connect this back to our personal and professional lives. I know for us in the Department of Neighborhoods and our role really to be the front door to the city for everybody in Columbus, thinking about how we can do an even better job of, being that welcoming voice, being that place to engage with everybody who has an issue and help them get involved in city government. Thank you all for being here.